Welcome to Swanson Reed's presentation on software research and development. This presentation will seek to provide information around the processes that companies conducting software development activities should follow for assessing whether their activities may qualify under the R&D tax incentive. The Australian government agency who regulates whether activities qualify under the R&D tax incentive legislation is AusIndustry. This presentation has been based on an AusIndustry guidance publication titled Software-Related Activities and the Research and Development Tax Incentive, which was released in April 2022. The April AusIndustry publication superseded an earlier version, which was released in October 2020, and which was covered in an earlier Swanson Reed video. Copies of the guidance documents are available on the AusIndustry website. The R&D tax incentive operates under a self-assessment framework, meaning companies lodge their R&D applications based on their own assessment of eligible activities and may have to substantiate their activities at a later time if their registration is subjected to a compliance review. For the purposes of assessment of activities under the R&D tax incentive, activities that a company conducts may be either eligible core R&D activities, eligible supporting R&D activities, or ineligible activities not to be registered. In order to register eligible activities in a given year, a company must conduct or plan to conduct at least one eligible core R&D activity. The definition of eligible core R&D activities is specified in the income tax legislation, and the policy intent of the legislated definition is to direct the R&D tax incentive towards those activities that are unlikely to be conducted by businesses in the absence of government support. The legislation prescribes that core R&D activities are experimental activities that meet two main requirements. Firstly, that the outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience, but can only be determined by applying a systematic progression of work that is based on the principles of established science and proceeds from hypothesis to experiment, observation and evaluation, and leads to logical conclusions. And secondly, that are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge, including new knowledge in the form of new or improved materials, products, devices, processes, or services. Both of these requirements must be met to establish that a core R&D activity is being conducted, and some exclusions apply, such as core activities in respect of software developed for the purpose of internal administration. If a company assesses that they have conducted or plan to conduct at least one core R&D activity, they can assess whether a project includes any activities that meet the definition of supporting R&D activities, which are those activities that directly relate to core R&D activities. The latest AusIndustry guidance seeks to break down the core R&D activity criteria and key terms in the context of software development. Particular emphasis in the guidance is placed on the company's onus to explain how they determined, at the outset of a core activity, that the technical outcome was not able to be determined in advance. Companies must demonstrate that, before starting the activity, they established that there was no available answer to a technical or scientific unknown, and how they established that there was no answer. AusIndustry expects that companies search widely for an existing way to achieve a potential activities goal before commencement, and that records of this search have been maintained. The guidance notes that suitable records of an attempt to attain existing knowledge may include searching information sources, such as computer science journals, open source code repositories such as GitHub, tech blogs, and patent searches. Alternatively, records of consultation with experts among professional networks may be accepted if the consulted parties are suitably qualified. AusIndustry also makes an emphasis that companies must demonstrate that there is a scientific or technical unknown which their core R&D activity seeks to resolve, as distinct from solving a business problem by applying existing knowledge. Relevant points to consider are noted within the guidance as being whether a technical objective is scientifically or technologically possible, whether existing knowledge or capability can be adapted to solve a problem within the same field of science or technology, or from another field of science or technology, the use of known processes, technologies, and methodologies, where the result or outcome is unknown, system unknowns, where the components of a system and their interactions are known, but the outcome or result of the system cannot be deduced from the outset, and whether something has already been shown to be possible but needs further work to make the technology more cost-effective, reliable, or reproducible. AusIndustry's position on the unknown outcome elements of the legislative criteria is that it must be an outcome that a competent professional cannot have known or have been able to determine in advance. A competent professional is a hypothetical person who, before the activity commenced, had access to the knowledge, skills, and qualifications needed to demonstrate expertise in an appropriate field, and had access to all of the current knowledge available in the relevant field from anywhere in the world, provided that the information or experience is publicly available or reasonably accessible. A core R&D activity will need to show that such a competent professional could not have determined the outcome in advance without applying a systematic progression of work that is based on principles of established science. In further breaking down the principles within recent AusIndustry guidance documents, a core R&D activity must involve unknown outcomes, the intention to generate new knowledge, and a systematic progression of work. Each of the requirements of the legislative definition must be met to qualify, and during compliance reviews, AusIndustry need to be satisfied that a company has met each relevant element. The latest guidance also notes that AusIndustry expect that companies record the hypothesis being tested, what the experiment or set of related experiments was and how it was conducted, what the results of the experiments were, and what conclusions were drawn from the results. The guidance also notes that companies may conduct software development using methodologies like Agile, Waterfall, and Rapid. However, regardless of the method used, if the activities are to be registered as R&D, a company will need to show that the outcome could not be determined in advance and that the methodologies were used as part of a systematic progression of work. A new development within the latest April 2022 guidance was AusIndustry's recognition that some routine testing activities, such as debugging and beta testing, can be part of a core R&D activity where they constitute part of a systematic progression of work. If a particular part of a project is not a core R&D activity, it may still qualify as a supporting R&D activity if directly related to a core R&D activity. The process of conducting a core R&D activity is particularly important, and companies should sequentially assess and describe the following within their applications: the hypothesis being tested, the design and setup of experiment, including key variables, observations, evaluations of results, and finally, logical conclusions made. The first element of the core R&D activity is the hypothesis, which is the company's idea for a new product or process being investigated during experiments. A hypothesis should relate to a specific technical or scientific uncertainty or a set of related knowledge gaps that is being tested by an experiment. The latest guidance notes that a company's hypothesis is their idea or theory to achieve a particular result, how they might achieve that result, and why that result may not be achievable. For example, you might find information from multiple sources stating that a particular compression algorithm can compress a 12 megapixel image but will exceed the power limits of existing processors. You might find other information that relates to methods to increase the efficiency of compression algorithms so that they will work with existing power limitations, which might give you an idea about how to improve an existing compression algorithm so that it can achieve a particular result. For example, to compress a 12 megapixel image without exceeding the limits of the low power processor. Alternatively, you might have an idea about how to create a new algorithm. A hypothesis will direct the design and conduct of an experiment, and AusIndustry notes within the guidance that there is an expectation that companies can show how their hypothesis was formed based on research into the current available knowledge. Experiments, for the purpose of the R&D tax incentive, involve a series of tasks that are undertaken in a planned and systematic way to evaluate a hypothesis. For example, they may involve the application of different iterations of proposed code solutions to a problem where the outcome is unknown. The experimental steps should be recorded in such a way that they can be understood or repeated by a competent professional in the field if required. Applicants should observe, measure, and record information and results that relate to the experiment, using qualitative, i.e. descriptive information, or quantitative numerical data. Then, the results of the experiments should be evaluated through assessment and analysis. Applicants need to consider what the results of the experiment mean. From this, logical conclusions can be drawn about whether the results supported the hypothesis and why or why not. Where experiments do not yield the required results, the inputs to the experiments, such as software code or design parameters, may be varied and further experiments conducted until such time that the outcome is known or able to be determined. A failed or abandoned experiment may still be eligible if the necessary criteria are met, and failed experiments may indeed help to evidence that there was an unknown outcome prior to conducting the failed experiment. A company must also show that core R&D activities are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. New knowledge must relate to knowledge that is new to the world or not reasonably available to a competent professional in the relevant field. It is not sufficient that the knowledge is new only to the organisation conducting the research. In some cases, knowledge might be known or likely to exist, but is not known publicly because of confidentiality. If this is the case, it may still be new under the definition of core R&D activities. Generating new knowledge does not need to be the sole purpose of an activity, but it must be a substantial purpose, and this purpose must be present from the outset of the activity. The AusIndustry guidance notes that an activity that only generated new knowledge by accident is unlikely to meet the purpose test. There must be an intentional purpose to generate new knowledge, and this knowledge generated must not just be a byproduct of normal commercial activity. Documenting the state of knowledge and the results of your search for existing knowledge before your activity commences is likely useful in demonstrating that a company intended to generate new knowledge from its activity. It's also important to note that there is a list of activities specifically excluded from being core R&D activities. These, however, may be supporting R&D activities if they're directly related to one or more core R&D activities and they're undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting core R&D activities. Developing, modifying, or customizing software for the dominant purpose of use in a company's own internal administration, including the internal administration of business functions, is legislatively excluded from being registered as a core R&D activity. AusIndustry's view is that software for internal administration may include functions such as business applications, such as payroll and accounting, management information systems, and enterprise resource planning systems. Interestingly, in prior AusIndustry guidance documents, it was noted that certain other activities, such as bug testing or user acceptance testing, may be unlikely to be core R&D activities because they do not necessarily involve a systematic progression of work, nor do they necessarily have the purpose of generating new knowledge. These comments around bug testing have not been repeated in the April 2022 guidance. However, companies should ensure that the general principles around unknown outcome, new knowledge, and systematic progression of work are adhered to for any activities claimed. If an activity does not meet the core R&D activity eligibility criteria itself, but is directly related to, and in some cases also undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting, a core R&D activity, it may still be eligible as supporting R&D activity. To be directly related, an activity must have a direct, close, or relatively immediate relationship with one or more core R&D activities. Activities that make a direct contribution to the conduct or evaluation of the experiment are likely to meet this requirement. You cannot, however, claim for a supporting R&D activity that is not directly related to an eligible core R&D activity. It's not enough for the activity to simply be part of the same project. It must be directly related to a specific and nominated core R&D activity. Examples of supporting R&D activities cited by AusIndustry in the guidance include setting up test beds, coding algorithms that will be used in an experiment, and collating a data sample that will be used to conduct a relevant experiment. In some cases, activities may only be eligible as supporting R&D activities if they are also undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting a core R&D activity. This additional requirement occurs where an activity is specifically excluded from being a core R&D activity, such as software for internal administration, market research, market testing, or market development, or where an activity is directly related to producing goods or services. In these cases, the activities will not be eligible if the purpose of supporting core R&D activities was of secondary importance. To satisfy the dominant purpose test, the purpose of undertaking the claimed supporting R&D activities must be the most important purpose. The April 2022 guidance has again included some interesting comments around cases where projects are terminated early. AusIndustry has specifically clarified that if an activity or project is terminated early, a company may still be able to claim for any R&D activities that meet the requirements of the legislation. For example, if an experiment returns a negative result, this may still be an outcome that could not be known or determined in advance and may still have the purpose of generating new knowledge, helping to affirm eligibility. If an activity or project is terminated after completing a supporting R&D activity, but not the core R&D activity it supports, the supporting activity can be eligible if a company can demonstrate that it had a genuine intention to conduct the core R&D activity, which did not eventuate. The guidance also discusses the requirement for claiming overseas R&D activities under the R&D tax incentive. Australian companies often engage overseas-based developers to conduct software development activities as part of their project, and if so, consideration of this issue is important. The April 2022 guidance provides a reminder of the well-established requirement that companies must attain a pre-approval to claim the costs of overseas R&D activities via a separate application, which is called an overseas finding. For a positive finding to be granted, a company must lodge the finding application by the end of the first year in which the activities are conducted and be able to demonstrate that the proposed overseas activity is eligible under the general criteria. There must be a significant scientific link between the proposed overseas activity and the Australian core R&D activity. The overseas activity must not be able to be conducted in Australia or its external territories for specific issues, including lack of availability of expertise and resources within Australia. And the costs of overseas R&D activities must be less than the costs of related R&D activities undertaken solely in Australia. As Australian companies will often engage overseas-based software developers for reasons of cost, rather than lack of Australian expertise, it's only in rare cases that overseas software development activities may be worth seeking a finding for under the R&D tax incentive. The guidance also clarifies that if you do not have a positive overseas finding, you must be able to demonstrate that the work underlying any activities claimed was carried out in Australia and not subcontracted out or otherwise performed overseas. For example, if an R&D entity engages an Australian company to undertake R&D activity on their behalf, and then this Australian company subcontracts the development activity to an overseas-based development team, then the cost of this activity will not be eligible to the R&D entity unless they had attained an overseas finding. Record keeping is a vital part of claiming the R&D tax incentive. Software developers may not be used to keeping extensive records, particularly if they adopt agile methodologies. However, AusIndustry expects you to keep records so that you can provide them in the case of a review. Within the appendices of the April 2022 guidance, there is a summary of records companies may keep for substantiating eligibility at the various stages of the R&D activity assessment process. For example, to show that the outcome of the experiments could not have been known or determined in advance, a company may keep records of literature reviews, email exchanges with industry experts, screenshots of questions posted on tech blogs, or details of failed attempts to use existing technology. As the activity progresses, to show that activities followed a systematic progression of experimental works, a company may keep records of each step of the experimental activity. This may include their code repositories, software versions, details of testing, strategy and approach, or project management documentation such as Gantt charts. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list. The April 2022 guidance includes a case study working through a theoretical company scenario of activities. This provides a good overview of how the ideal claim should be assessed and documented. That concludes the presentation on assessment of software R&D activities. As AusIndustry has now released multiple versions of their software sector guidance, it's likely that additional publications may be released in the foreseeable future. Should you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with our office. There is also additional material available on our website, as well as the website of the ATO and AusIndustry. Thank you.